The divorce was final. Amelia surveyed the living room, a space now scrubbed clean of Daniel's quiet presence. Her new life with Julian was about to begin, gleaming and unblemished. She had the house, a magnificent glass and steel structure overlooking the water that she felt she had earned through years of social maneuvering and hosting parties Daniel had quietly endured. She had her status, now elevated by her association with Julian, a man whose wealth was as loud and conspicuous as his laughter. In the final asset division, a process she had orchestrated with surgical precision, she had claimed everything of tangible value. The art, the furniture, the portfolio of stocks she'd managed. Daniel, a man she had long ago recategorized in her mind from husband to disappointment, had put up no fight. He had agreed to everything with a placid, almost unnerving calm. Her final walkthrough was a victory lap. As she passed the open door to the three-car garage, she paused. There, against the far wall, sat the last remnant of her former husband's failed ambitions. It was a large, heavy-duty toolbox, its once bright red paint now peeling to reveal patches of dull, angry rust. It looked like something salvaged from a shipyard, an industrial relic that was a constant, ugly reminder of the man she had married, a man who tinkered with ideas but never seemed to build anything real. "Are you going to get your junk out of here, Daniel?" she'd asked him on the phone an hour earlier, her voice sharp with impatience. "I'll have someone pick it up tomorrow," he had replied, his tone even, as always. "Fine," she'd snapped, "just make sure they do. Julian wants the space for his new convertible." She had glanced at the toolbox with utter disdain. It was worthless, an eyesore. She had thought about just having the movers throw it in a dumpster, but her lawyer had advised against it. Something about the legalities of disposing of personal property, even junk. So it sat there, a final, pathetic symbol of his life. She thought he was a failure, a brilliant academic who had squandered his potential on obscure consulting projects that barely paid the bills. She didn't know that the rusty, forgotten toolbox wasn't filled with wrenches and greasy rags. She didn't know it was a custom-built, climate-controlled, Faraday-caged server housing. She didn't know that inside it, nestled in shock-absorbent foam, were the solid-state drives that contained the source code, patents, and transaction ledgers for Prometheus, a revolutionary financial modeling algorithm he had single-handedly designed. And she certainly didn't know that a single wire transfer receipt resting inside a simple manila envelope, tucked securely between two of those drives, confirmed his first royalty payment for that algorithm. The payment was for $3,200,000. Within 48 hours, the contents of that toolbox would not just change his life. They would systematically dismantle the world she had so carefully and so cruelly constructed. Hey everyone, thanks for joining me for this story. It's one that really gets you thinking about what we value in people. Do you think you can truly know someone you live with every day? Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy stories about hidden strength and seeing arrogance get its comeuppance, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Now, let's get back to it. The roots of Amelia's misconception ran deep, nurtured over years in the fertile soil of her own ambition. 6 months before the divorce was finalized, the house had been alive with the sound of forced laughter and the clinking of expensive wine glasses. It was Amelia's birthday, and Julian, not yet her partner but already her project, was holding court. He stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling window, a silhouette of tailored confidence against the glittering city skyline. Daniel was on the other side of the room, near the bookshelf, speaking quietly with an old professor of his who had come out of a sense of loyalty. Daniel had always preferred the quiet currents of conversation to the crashing waves of a party. He felt like a ghost at these events, a remnant of a past Amelia was actively trying to erase. He saw the way she looked at him, a flicker of irritation, a hint of shame. He was a piece of furniture that no longer matched the decor. Julian's voice, a rich baritone accustomed to commanding attention, sliced through the ambient chatter. "So, Daniel," he began, turning his body so the whole room became his audience. "Amelia tells me you're a consultant. Sounds vague. What is it you actually consult on? The proper way to stack books?" A few sycophantic chuckles rippled through the group. Amelia smiled, a tight, brittle thing. She saw this not as an insult to her husband, but as a performance by Julian, a display of the alpha dominance she found so appealing. It was a confirmation of her choice. Daniel met Julian's gaze from across the room. There was no anger in his eyes, only a deep, weary stillness. It was the look of a man observing a predictable weather pattern. "I work with data models," Daniel said, his voice calm and measured, refusing to be drawn into the performance. "Financial forecasting, risk analysis, it's mostly theoretical." "Theoretical," Julian repeated, savoring the word as if it were a fine wine he was about to declare corked. "Ah, theoretical money, my favorite kind. It's the kind that doesn't pay for a house like this." He gestured expansively at the room, at the life he was preparing to usurp. "I deal in the real world, you see. Concrete, steel, things you can touch, things that make a man's reputation." The insult landed, sharp and deliberate. It was designed to paint Daniel as an emasculated dreamer, a man lost in abstractions while real men, like Julian, built the world. Daniel felt the familiar sting, not of the insult itself, but of his wife's complicity. He saw her nod subtly in agreement, her eyes shining with admiration for Julian. She was an audience member at her own husband's humiliation, and she was enjoying the show. He didn't respond. Instead, his hand went to his pocket, his fingers closing around a small, cold piece of metal. It was a key, not for the house or a car. It was a uniquely cut, high-security key for the dual locks on the rusty toolbox in the garage. In his mind's eye, he saw the blinking green lights of the server inside, humming quietly, invisibly processing trillions of data points from global markets. Theoretical. He almost smiled. Julian was talking about concrete and steel, but the world, the real world Julian so proudly claimed, was now run by invisible forces, by the very theoretical models Daniel was building. The irony was a fortress around him, a silent, unbreachable defense. Amelia's mother, Eleanor, a woman whose face was a mask of perfectly preserved disapproval, glided over to him later in the evening. "Daniel," she said, her voice dripping with condescension disguised as concern, "you must feel a bit out of your depth here. Julian is so dynamic. He's a wonderful influence on Amelia. He encourages her to shine." The implication was clear. Daniel was a shadow from which her daughter was finally, mercifully, emerging. "Julian is very confident," Daniel replied, the words chosen with care. He would not give them the satisfaction of an argument. He would not perform his anger for their entertainment. "Confidence comes from success, dear," Eleanor said, patting his arm, as if he were a child who had just lost a board game. "Perhaps you should think about something more practical. A man needs to provide. It's about dignity." Dignity. The word hung in the air between them. He thought of the non-disclosure agreements he had signed, the ones that prevented him from speaking about the 9-figure fund that ran on his Prometheus algorithm. He thought of the encrypted emails from Mr. Sterling, the senior partner at the firm that had acquired his work, discussing the next phase of deployment. He thought of the quiet satisfaction of solving a problem so complex that only a handful of people on the planet could even understand it. And he looked at Eleanor's perfectly coiffed hair and Julian's diamond watch and Amelia's desperate, hungry smile. He felt a profound sense of pity for them. They were living in a world of surfaces, completely blind to the depths that lay just beneath. His dignity was intact. It was their own that was in question. As the party wound down and he watched Amelia laugh a little too loudly at another of Julian's pronouncements, he made a decision. He would not fight for the marriage. A structure with a rotten foundation cannot be saved. It must be demolished. He would let her have the house. He would let her have it all. All he needed was his toolbox. The meeting with the divorce lawyers was a masterclass in condescension. They sat at a long, polished mahogany table in a conference room that smelled of money and aggressive litigation. Amelia was flanked by her lawyer, a shark named Marcus Thorne, whose suit was as sharp as his reputation. Daniel sat alone. He had declined to bring his own counsel, a move that Thorne had interpreted as the ultimate sign of weakness and destitution. "Mr. Hayes," Thorne began, sliding a sheaf of papers across the table. "Let's be frank. My client has been more than generous." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "She is assuming the full mortgage on the primary residence, a property valued at, what was it, Amelia? $7 million? Amelia nodded, a flicker of pride in her eyes. 7.2, actually. The market is up. 7.2, Thorne repeated, as if the number itself were an argument. She is also retaining the entirety of the joint investment portfolio, which, as you know, she has managed exclusively for the past 5 years. In exchange for your full and immediate cooperation, she is prepared to offer you a one-time payment of $50,000 to help you get back on your feet. The offer was so insulting it was almost comical. It was a sum calculated to signal his utter worthlessness in their eyes. It was walking away money for a janitor, not a spouse of 10 years. Daniel felt a strange sense of calm descend upon him. He had anticipated this. He had, in fact, counted on it. He looked at Amelia. Her expression was a carefully constructed mask of detached pity. She was playing the role of the magnanimous victor. She truly believed she was doing him a favor, cutting him loose from a life he could no longer afford. Her blindness was no longer just a character flaw, it was a strategic vulnerability. Daniel picked up the papers. He didn't read them. He already knew what they said. He knew the clauses that stripped him of any claim to future earnings, the ones that defined his current profession as unemployed academic. He had spent the last week not with divorce lawyers, but with patent attorneys and senior partners at Sterling Cromwell, the investment firm that now owned his intellectual property. His legal preparations were of a different and far more lethal nature. "This seems acceptable," Daniel said quietly. The silence in the room was absolute. Marcus Thorne's jaw, for a fraction of a second, went slack. He had been prepared for begging, for arguments, for a pathetic display of desperation. He was not prepared for immediate, quiet acceptance. He narrowed his eyes, searching for an angle, a trick. He found none. He saw only a defeated man. Amelia let out a small, almost imperceptible sigh of relief. It was over. It had been this easy. "Good," she said, her voice losing its feigned sympathy and taking on a businesslike briskness. "I'm glad we can be civil about this." "There's just one thing," Daniel said, his tone unchanging. He slid the papers back across the table. "Under the section for personal effects, I'd like to add one item to be collected at my discretion within 30 days of vacating the residence." Thorne leaned forward, suspicious. "What item?" "An old toolbox," Daniel said. "It's in the garage, red, rusty, of no monetary value, just sentimental." Amelia scoffed lightly. "That piece of junk? Of course, Daniel. Take it. I was going to have it thrown out anyway." Thorne looked from Amelia to Daniel and back again. A rusty toolbox? It made no sense, but it was too trivial to contest. It was, in fact, the perfect symbol of the man he was dealing with, a man fighting for scraps, for sentimental junk, while the real treasure was sailing away from him. He made a note on the document with a gold fountain pen. So noted, the rusty toolbox, sentimental value only. He smiled a tight, predatory smile. "If that's all, I believe we are done here." Daniel stood up. "We are." He walked out of the conference room, not looking back. He didn't see the triumphant, knowing glance that passed between Amelia and her lawyer. He didn't need to. He could feel it. He walked down the marble hallway and out into the bright afternoon sun. He felt no anger, no sadness. He felt only the quiet, thrumming satisfaction of a complex machine whose gears were finally, perfectly, beginning to engage. He had just willingly signed away millions in shared assets. In their minds, he had confirmed his own failure. In reality, he had just armed the detonator. They had mistaken his patience for weakness. They thought they were closing a book when he was just finishing the first chapter of a story they would not be able to put down. They had given him exactly what he wanted, their complete and utter confidence in his defeat, and that confidence was the weapon he would use against them. Daniel's new apartment was a stark contrast to the sprawling, opulent house he had left behind. It was a modest one-bedroom in a clean, unremarkable building downtown, with a view of a brick wall and a sliver of sky. The furniture was sparse, functional. A bed, a desk, a single comfortable armchair. It was a space stripped of all pretense, a monk's cell for a man focused on a singular purpose. The chaos of his old life had been shed, leaving behind a core of focused intensity. He wasn't destitute. The $50,000 settlement check sat on his kitchen counter, uncashed. It was a trophy of their arrogance, and he planned to frame it. His real income was invisible, flowing not into a joint account Amelia could see, but into a secured corporate trust managed by Sterling Cromwell. He was living simply, not out of necessity, but out of choice. He was a man in waiting, a general living in a tent on the eve of a great battle. His laptop was open on the desk. On the screen was the face of a man in his late 60s, with piercing blue eyes and a halo of white hair. This was Arthur Sterling, the founding partner of the firm. He was a legend in the financial world, a man who operated with the quiet lethality of a great white shark. "The final papers are signed, Arthur," Daniel said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty room. Sterling nodded, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "And they took the bait? She and her, what is he, a real estate peacock?" "They believe I'm penniless," Daniel confirmed. "They were happy to let me keep my sentimental toolbox." Sterling let out a dry chuckle. "A $3.2 million sentiment. The board is ecstatic, Daniel. Prometheus's first quarter performance exceeded even our most optimistic projections. It's not just an algorithm, it's a crystal ball. The bonus was a foregone conclusion. The next one will have another zero on it." "I'm not thinking about the next one yet," Daniel said. "I'm thinking about the handover." Sterling's expression turned serious. He understood this was no longer just a business transaction for Daniel. It had become personal. "The legal team is ready. We have the preliminary injunction drafted against Julian Thorne's development company. It turns out Mr. Thorne has been using a proprietary market analysis software his company licensed. A software that, our forensics team has discovered, contains a key component that infringes on one of the ancillary patents for Prometheus." Daniel felt a cold, clean satisfaction. It was perfect. Julian, the man of concrete and steel, had built his house on stolen digital sand. "Is the infringement significant?" "Legally, it's a slam dunk," Sterling said. "It's a minor piece of code relating to demographic shift prediction, but it's yours, and therefore it is ours. We can tie up his current projects in litigation for years, freeze his assets. His lenders will scatter like pigeons. For a man like that, reputation is everything. An injunction for intellectual property theft? He'll be radioactive." This was the strategic brilliance of Arthur Sterling. He didn't just attack, he dismantled. He found the single thread that, when pulled, would unravel the entire tapestry. "And for Amelia?" Daniel asked, his voice softer. Sterling's gaze softened with a hint of paternal concern. "That is not a legal matter, Daniel. It's a personal one. The house is legally hers. The portfolio is hers. You signed the papers. What happens to her is a consequence of what happens to him. When his financial world collapses, her social world will follow. Is that what you want?" Daniel was silent for a long moment, staring at the brick wall outside his window. What did he want? Revenge? He found the thought distasteful. Vengeance was a hot, messy emotion. What he felt was cold and precise. It was a desire for balance, for truth. He wanted them to see. He wanted them to understand the reality of the world they lived in and the true nature of the man they had so casually discarded. He wanted to hold up a mirror to their arrogance and force them to look at their own reflections. "I want them to have a choice," Daniel said finally. "I want to give them one last chance to walk away with their dignity intact, a chance I know they won't take." Sterling nodded slowly, understanding completely. The quiet bomb. You'll present the truth, and they will refuse to believe it. Their own pride will be the instrument of their destruction. It's a bold strategy, Daniel. Theatrical. I approve. "The handover for the house is Friday," Daniel said. "I've arranged for a courier to pick up the toolbox at 3 o'clock. A specialized courier from your firm." "Our security logistics team will handle it personally," Sterling confirmed. "They're ex-special forces. They once moved a Fabergé egg through a war zone. I think they can handle a trip to the suburbs. They will arrive at 3:15, precisely. That should give you enough time." "Thank you, Arthur." "Don't thank me, Daniel," Sterling said, his voice firm. "You have made this firm an obscene amount of money. More importantly, you have given us a weapon that will dominate the market for the next decade. We are merely protecting our asset, and, if I may be so bold, our asset's peace of mind." The call ended. Daniel closed the laptop. The room was quiet again. He walked to the window and looked at that small patch of blue sky. He thought of Amelia and Julian, preparing to celebrate their victory in his former home. They were dancing on the deck of a ship they believed was unsinkable, laughing at the man they had just thrown overboard. They had no idea that he was the one holding the map to the iceberg. Friday. The quiet preparation was over. It was time for the storm. Friday arrived, draped in the crisp, brilliant light of late autumn. The air was cold, but the sun was bright, making the glass walls of the house sparkle. It felt like a day for new beginnings, or for final endings. Daniel drove his modest sedan, a car Amelia had despised, up the long, curving driveway for the last time. He parked behind Julian's car, a flamboyant Italian convertible the color of arterial blood. The contrast was not lost on him. He walked to the front door, his footsteps echoing on the expensive flagstone. Before he could ring the bell, the door swung open. Julian stood there, beaming, an arm draped possessively around Amelia's shoulder. He was wearing a cashmere sweater and a triumphant smirk. Amelia looked radiant, flushed with victory. Behind them, in the cavernous living room, stood her mother, Eleanor, holding a glass of champagne, her face a portrait of smug satisfaction. "Daniel," Julian said, his voice booming with false magnanimity. Come in, don't stand on ceremony, not that you ever did." He chuckled, squeezing Amelia's shoulder. "Just here to pick up the last of your, treasures?" "Something like that," Daniel said, stepping inside. The house felt alien to him now. It was a stage set for a life he was no longer a part of. The air was thick with their success, a cloying perfume of self-congratulation. "We were just having a little toast," Amelia said, her voice bright and brittle. "To the future." She gestured towards the champagne bottle chilling in a silver bucket. "Would you like a glass? Oh, I suppose you're driving." The comment was a tiny pinprick, a reminder of his diminished status. He was the help now, the man with the sensible car. "I'm fine, thank you," Daniel said. "I've arranged for a pickup at 3. I'm just here to make sure everything is in order." "Excellent, excellent," Julian boomed. "The sooner we get that monstrosity out of the garage, the better. My new baby needs her space." He winked at Amelia. He was performing for her, for Eleanor, reinforcing the narrative of his own superiority. They walked him to the garage as if escorting a tradesman. The overhead door was open, flooding the space with afternoon light. There it sat, against the wall, the rusty red toolbox. It looked even more pathetic in the pristine, organized garage, surrounded by gleaming new storage cabinets and high-end sporting equipment Julian had already installed. Julian walked over to it and gave it a kick with his expensive leather loafer. The clang echoed in the large space. God, it's an ugly brute, isn't it? What do you even keep in here, Danny boy? Broken dreams? A collection of participation trophies? Eleanor, who had followed them, tittered politely. Julian, you're awful, she said with no conviction whatsoever. Amelia shook her head, a look of genuine pity on her face. This was the final act of her narrative, the final confirmation of her wise choice. Honestly, Daniel, why do you even want it? Let us just dispose of it for you. It'll save you the trouble. This was the moment. This was the final gratuitous twist of the knife. It was one thing to be underestimated, to be discarded. It was another to be mocked in your defeat by the very people who had orchestrated it. He had been prepared to let the courier simply take the box. He had been prepared to walk away in silence, letting the legal consequences unfold on their own time. But this casual, public, final act of humiliation changed everything. This required a direct response. The quiet satisfaction of a distant, anonymous legal victory was no longer enough. They needed to see, they needed to know who they were kicking. Daniel looked from Julian's sneering face to Amelia's pitying one, to Eleanor's smug gaze. He saw the complete, unshakable certainty in their eyes. They were standing on the summit of their own arrogance, and the air was very thin up there. He looked at his watch. It was 2:55. The courier would arrive in 20 minutes. He had time. Actually, Daniel said, his voice devoid of any anger or resentment. It was calm, clear, and carried a new and unsettling weight. Before it goes, I wonder if I might have a moment of your time. There are a few details about our separation that I think you'll find illuminating. Julian laughed. Illuminating? What, you found a $20 bill in an old coat? Don't tell me you're going to contest the settlement now. The ink is barely dry. You'd be laughed out of court. I have no intention of contesting the settlement, Daniel said, his eyes locking onto Julian's. The settlement is perfect. It's this house, this life you're building together. I just want to talk about its foundation. There was a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle change in pressure. Daniel's utter lack of agitation was more unnerving than any outburst would have been. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't angry. He was something else, something they didn't have a name for. What are you talking about, Daniel? Amelia asked, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. The victory party was being spoiled by the ghost at the feast. Daniel turned his gaze to her. I'm talking about value, Amelia, about what things are worth. You've become an expert in that, haven't you? The house is worth $7.2 million. Julian's car is worth $300,000. Your portfolio, what, another $2? You are very good at calculating the value of things you can see. He took a small step towards them, out of the shadows of the garage and into the bright sunlight. But you've forgotten how to measure the value of things you can't. Integrity, patience, and intellectual property. He pulled a slim, elegant folder from the inside of his simple jacket. It was not the thick, messy bundle of legal papers from the divorce. It was thin, crisp, and bore a simple embossed logo on the front, a stylized SC, Sterling Cromwell. I have some final paperwork, Daniel said, his voice dropping to an almost conversational tone, a tone that was somehow more menacing than a shout. Not from my lawyer, from my employer. I thought you might want to see it. The air in the garage grew still and cold. Julian's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. Amelia's celebratory flush began to recede, leaving her skin pale and tight. Eleanor stopped sipping her champagne. The party was over. The quiet bomb had been placed on the table, and Daniel Hayes, the man they thought they had vanquished, was about to press the button. The quiet before the storm had broken, and the first drops of a rain they could not have imagined were beginning to fall. Daniel held the folder, not opening it yet. He let the silence stretch, letting the weight of the moment press down on them. Their confidence, so absolute just moments before, was beginning to show cracks. It was like watching ice fracture in slow motion. "What is this, Daniel?" Amelia finally asked, her voice strained. "Some kind of joke?" "I've never known you to have much of a sense of humor, Amelia," Daniel replied calmly. He met her gaze. "And I can assure you, I'm not joking now." He turned to Julian, who had crossed his arms, affecting an air of bored impatience that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Julian, you said you deal in the real world. Concrete and steel. Let's talk about the real world. The real world runs on information. It runs on data. Specifically, it runs on predictive analysis of that data. Who will buy what? When will a market turn? Where is the next bubble forming?" He tapped the folder. "My vague consulting work, as you called it, has been in that field. For the last 3 years, I have been the sole architect of a proprietary modeling algorithm. We call it Prometheus." Julian snorted, a desperate attempt to reclaim his dominance. "An algorithm? You built a fancy spreadsheet, Danny boy. Congratulations. What's that worth? 50, 60 grand a year?" "Prometheus is not a spreadsheet," Daniel said, his voice cutting through Julian's bluster with surgical precision. "It's a self-correcting heuristic system that analyzes global market volatility with a 94% accuracy rate for trend prediction. It's currently being used by Sterling Cromwell to manage a $7 billion hedge fund." He let that number hang in the air. $7 billion. It was a figure so large it was almost an abstraction, but it was an abstraction they understood. It was a number that dwarfed their $7.2 million house into insignificance. Eleanor made a small, choking sound. Amelia's face was a mask of disbelief. "You're lying," she whispered. It was a statement of faith, a desperate prayer against the encroaching reality. "Am I?" Daniel opened the folder. He didn't show it to them yet. He simply looked down at the top page. "According to the terms of my acquisition contract with Sterling Cromwell, I retain a percentage of the net profit generated by my intellectual property. It's a fairly standard arrangement for assets of this nature." He looked up, his eyes finding Amelia's. "You were always so meticulous about the finances, Amelia. You tracked every dollar, but you only tracked the accounts you knew about. You never thought to ask about the corporate trust account set up for me by my employer." He pulled out a single sheet of paper from the folder. It was a simple, sterile document, a wire transfer confirmation from a bank they had never heard of. He held it up. "This is a copy of the transfer confirmation for my first royalty payment for the first quarter of this fiscal year." He paused, letting them read the numbers from across the garage. The figures were stark and undeniable. $3,200,000. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the garage. Eleanor had dropped her champagne flute. It lay in a glittering puddle at her feet. $3.2 million, Daniel said, his voice a quiet hammer blow. "That's my share. For 3 months of work. The settlement you offered me was $50,000 to help me get back on my feet." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, not of humor, but of pure, crystalline irony. I appreciated the gesture. Amelia stared at the paper, then at Daniel's face, then at the rusty toolbox. Her mind was reeling, frantically trying to reconcile the man she had mocked with the number on that page. The two realities could not coexist. One of them had to be a lie, and she was beginning to feel the terrifying certainty that the lie was the one she had built her entire world upon. "So you have some money," Julian sneered, his voice tight with a desperate, failing bravado. "You got lucky with some tech deal. It doesn't change anything. The house is Amelia's. The divorce is final." "You signed it all away, you idiot." "You're right," Daniel said, turning his full attention to Julian. "I did. I have no claim on this house. I have no claim on Amelia. I wanted this to be a clean break." He slid the transfer confirmation back into the folder and pulled out a different document. This one was thicker, bound in blue. But you, Julian, have a claim on something of mine, or rather, something of my employer's. He held up the new document. This is a preliminary injunction filed this morning in federal court. It seems the proprietary market analysis software your development company uses, VistaTrack, contains a small but critical piece of code that infringes on patent 7,845,112B, a patent for a demographic prediction model, a patent which I wrote and which is now the exclusive property of Sterling Cromwell. Julian's face went white. The color drained from it as if a plug had been pulled. That's impossible. Our forensic team seems to think it's very possible, Daniel continued, his tone relentless. The injunction freezes all assets and operations of Thorn Development pending a full investigation. All your lines of credit will be suspended. Your investors will be notified by the end of the day. A man who deals in concrete and steel should know that a foundation is everything. And your foundation, Julian, appears to be stolen. As if on cue, a long black town car, sleek and silent as a shark, pulled into the driveway. It stopped behind Julian's garish convertible, effectively boxing it in. The back door opened, and a man in a perfectly tailored gray suit stepped out. It was Arthur Sterling. He was flanked by two other men, large and impassive, who moved with an unmistakable air of professional security. Sterling walked calmly towards the garage, his expensive shoes making no sound on the pavement. He nodded once to Daniel, a gesture of respect and confirmation. Then he turned his piercing blue eyes on Julian. "Mr. Thorne," Sterling said, his voice calm but carrying the absolute authority of a man who moved markets with a single phone call. "I am Arthur Sterling. I believe you've been made aware of our pending legal action. My team is here to serve you the papers, officially." He gestured to one of the men, who stepped forward and offered a thick envelope to Julian. Julian stared at the envelope as if it were a snake. His bravado was gone, shattered. He was a man watching his own empire burn to the ground in the space of 5 minutes. Sterling then turned his gaze to the rusty toolbox. "And my logistics team is here for Mr. Hayes's property." He smiled faintly. "We do like to protect our assets." The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been inverted with a terrifying, cosmic violence. Daniel Hayes, the failed academic, the man of theoretical money, was now the center of gravity in a universe that had suddenly and irrevocably reordered itself. Amelia stood frozen, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with the horror of a revelation so total, so devastating, that it had erased her entire world. The man she had discarded was not a failure. He was a king in hiding, and she had just handed him back his crown, his scepter, and the keys to a kingdom she never even knew existed. All she had left was a $7 million house built on a sinkhole. The immediate aftermath was a symphony of collapse, played in stunned silence. Julian Thorne, the man of booming confidence, stood utterly still, the thick legal envelope clutched in his hand like a death sentence. His face, usually flushed with success and self-satisfaction, was now a ghastly, waxy white. He looked from the implacable face of Arthur Sterling to the calm, unreadable expression of Daniel, and in that moment, he understood. This was not a negotiation. This was a demolition. Sterling's security team, moving with quiet, intimidating efficiency, approached the toolbox. One of them produced a small electronic device, scanning the locks before inserting two separate, uniquely cut keys. There was a series of soft, hydraulic clicks, and the heavy lid hissed open. For a brief, tantalizing moment, Amelia caught a glimpse inside, not of greasy tools, but of gleaming, precisely arranged black boxes, crisscrossed with fiber optic cables, all glowing with soft, internal green lights. It looked like the heart of a spaceship. It was the physical manifestation of a world she had never known existed, a world her husband had inhabited while she was busy planning dinner parties. They closed the lid, the clicks echoing like the shutting of a vault door. With practiced ease, they lifted the heavy container onto a specialized dolly and wheeled it towards the waiting town car. As they passed, Daniel placed his hand on the cool metal for a moment, a final, silent farewell. Sterling addressed Julian one last time, his voice cutting through the thick silence. "Our legal department will be in contact with your counsel, Mr. Thorne. I would advise you to retain someone who specializes in intellectual property law, and I would advise them to recommend a swift and unconditional settlement." He didn't wait for a reply. He gave another slight nod to Daniel, turned, and got back into his car. The door shut with a solid, final thud. The car reversed smoothly, navigated the turn, and disappeared down the long driveway, taking the $3.2 million toolbox with it. The garage was suddenly empty, save for the three figures frozen in a tableau of ruin. The bright afternoon sun seemed to mock them. Amelia was the first to break. A choked sob escaped her lips. She turned to Daniel, her eyes wild with a desperate, frantic hope. "Daniel, I didn't know." "That," Daniel said, his voice flat, devoid of the triumph she might have expected, "is the entire point. You didn't know. You didn't ask. You didn't care to look beyond the surface. You made your judgment based on what you could see, and you built your world on that judgment." "We can fix this," she pleaded, taking a step towards him. The mask of the victor had crumbled, revealing the terrified face of a woman who had just gambled everything and lost. "The divorce. We can undo it. Daniel, please." He looked at her, and for the first time, he felt a sliver of the pity Eleanor had once shown him. But his was genuine. He pitied her for her profound, self-imposed blindness. "Undo it?" he asked, the question hanging in the air. "Why would I do that, Amelia? So I can return to a life of being your embarrassing secret? So I can watch you admire men like him?" He gestured towards Julian, who still hadn't moved, a statue of broken pride. "You didn't want a husband, you wanted an accessory, and it turns out you chose a counterfeit." He turned to leave. His work here was done. The mirror had been shown. The reflection was theirs to live with. "Wait!" It was Julian. His voice was a raw, ragged whisper. "What do you want? Money? Is that it? Name your price." Daniel stopped at the edge of the garage and turned back. He looked at the man who had mocked him, humiliated him, kicked his rusty toolbox just 30 minutes earlier. He saw not a rival, but a hollow man, stripped of his only asset, his bluster. "I have money, Julian," Daniel said simply. "This isn't about money. This is about consequences. You built your success on a lie. A small one, maybe, but it was a lie that connected your world to mine, and my world is very, very particular about its integrity." He then looked back at Amelia, who was now openly weeping, her carefully constructed composure shattered into a million pieces. "You want to fix this, Amelia?" he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "It's very simple. You have the house. You have the portfolio. I signed the papers. I will not contest them. I want nothing from you." He paused. "But I will require one thing, a public statement, a full-page ad in the city's business journal. In it, you will issue a formal apology to me, retracting the narrative of my failure that you so carefully cultivated among our friends and your family. And you will make a substantial donation in your name, a $1 million donation." "$1 million?" she gasped. "To who?" Daniel's expression was unyielding. "To the university's endowment fund for postgraduate research in theoretical sciences. The very fund you always said was a waste of money for people who couldn't make it in the real world." It was poetic justice, delivered with the precision of a surgeon. He was not taking her money for himself. He was forcing her to publicly validate the very world she had despised, to use her real money to support the theoretical work she had scorned. He was forcing her to choose between her pride and her financial ruin. Because if Julian's company collapsed, her $7 million house and her precious portfolio would be next, swallowed by his debts. Without another word, Daniel turned and walked to his modest car. He got in, started the engine, and drove away, not once looking at the house in his rearview mirror. He left them there, in the gleaming, empty garage, with the wreckage of their perfect future scattered around them. The silence they were left with was heavier than any toolbox, and the truth was a weight they would now have to carry alone. The weeks that followed were a slow, agonizing unraveling for Amelia and Julian. The injunction from Sterling Cromwell acted like a chemical agent, dissolving the foundations of Julian's company with terrifying speed. His lines of credit were frozen overnight. Lenders who had once clamored for his business now sent curt, formal letters invoking penalty clauses. His investors, a flock of nervous, wealthy individuals who valued stability above all else, began to pull out, their polite phone calls quickly escalating to panicked demands. The phrase intellectual property theft was a death knell in their world. It spoke of recklessness, of a lack of integrity, of a fatal flaw in his character. Julian, the master of surfaces, discovered that his reputation had been as hollow as his promises. He fought, at first. He hired a team of expensive lawyers who talked tough in initial meetings, promising to file counter motions and bury Sterling Cromwell in paperwork. But their bluster faded after their first conference call with Sterling's legal department. They were met not with aggression, but with a calm, overwhelming avalanche of evidence. Code comparisons, server logs, depositions from former employees. Sterling's team had been preparing this case for months. They hadn't come to fight, they had come to announce a checkmate. Julian's lawyers advised him to settle. The alternative was a protracted, public, and unwinnable legal battle that would end in his professional ruin and possible bankruptcy. Amelia watched this collapse from the front lines. The house, once her symbol of triumph, began to feel like a gilded cage. The phone calls from irate investors started bleeding over to her. The whispers at the club, the sideways glances at the charity galas she could still bear to attend, grew louder. She was no longer the woman who had cleverly traded up. She was the woman who had attached herself to a fraud. Her social standing, a currency she valued as much as any stock, was in free fall. Her mother, Eleanor, was a constant, unnerving presence. Her initial shock had curdled into a bitter, simmering resentment, directed not at Daniel, but at Amelia. "How could you be so blind?" she would ask, her voice sharp with accusation, as they sat in the vast, silent living room. "All those years and you never saw him? You lived with him and you had no idea who he was." "How could I have known?" Amelia would retort, her voice cracking. "He never said anything. He let me believe he was struggling." "He didn't have to say anything," Eleanor snapped back one afternoon, her composure finally breaking. "A man like that, a man with that kind of mind, his value isn't in what he says, it's in what he does. You were so busy looking for a man who made a splash, you missed the one who controlled the tides. You chose the flashy yacht and threw the captain of the entire fleet overboard." The argument was brutal, stripping away the last vestiges of Amelia's self-delusion. Her mother, her greatest enabler, the co-author of her narrative of superiority, had now become her chief accuser. Eleanor saw the situation with the cold clarity of someone whose own social position was now threatened by her daughter's catastrophic misjudgment. The final blow came from Julian. He came home late one night, smelling of stale whiskey and defeat. He slumped onto a ridiculously expensive sofa that neither of them could now afford. "It's over," he said, his voice hollow. "I have to settle. They're going to let me off with a massive licensing fee and a public admission of infringement. It will wipe out most of my liquid assets. The company might survive, but it'll be a shell. I'll have to sell the properties in development." Amelia stood across the room, feeling nothing. No sympathy, no anger, just a vast, gray emptiness. "And the donation?" she asked quietly. "Daniel's condition?" Julian laughed, a harsh, broken sound. The $1 million? Of course, your $1 million. It's either that or they proceed with the full lawsuit, which would trigger my debt covenants and we'd lose everything, including this house. He looked around the room with dead eyes. He has us. He has us completely. In that moment, Amelia saw Julian for what he was. Not a titan, not a builder of empires, but a gambler who had been playing with marked cards and had finally been called out. His confidence had been a costume, and it had just been stripped away. She was faced with a choice, a terrible, clarifying choice. She could cling to the wreckage, try to salvage her life with Julian, a life now built on debt and disgrace. Or she could face the truth. She could perform the act of contrition Daniel had demanded. It was an act of ultimate humiliation, a public declaration of her own blindness and cruelty. But in a strange way, it also felt like the only path back to solid ground. It was the only action that felt real in a world that had become a nightmare of illusions. Late that night, long after Julian had passed out on the sofa, Amelia sat at the kitchen island with a single sheet of expensive, cream-colored stationery. The house was silent around her. She thought about Daniel. She thought about his quiet patience, his dignity in the face of her scorn. She thought about the way he had looked at her in the garage, not with hatred, but with a profound, unshakable pity. He hadn't destroyed them for sport. He had simply held up a mirror, and they had shattered themselves against their own reflection. With a hand that trembled slightly, she began to write. It was not the public apology for the business journal. That would be drafted by lawyers. This was something else. Daniel, she wrote, you were right. I didn't know. But the truth is, I didn't want to. It was easier to believe you were failing than to admit I no longer understood your world. It was easier to tear you down than to face my own insecurities. I built my life on a lie, and I am so, so sorry. She put the pen down. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was a start. It was a single small stone of truth laid as the first part of a new foundation. The cost of her education had been her entire world. The lesson was simple and devastating. True worth is not something you can see, and respect is not something you can demand. It must be earned. And sometimes it is revealed in the most unexpected and most humbling of ways. Months passed. The seasons turned. The sharp, bright autumn that had witnessed the collapse of Amelia's world gave way to the quiet, introspective gray of winter. The full-page notice appeared in the business journal, a stark block of text on a crisp white page. It was written in dry legalese, but the message was clear. It was a formal apology from Amelia Thorne. She had started using Julian's name, a final, futile attempt to cling to the wreckage, to Daniel Hayes, acknowledging his significant, previously unpublicized contributions to the field of financial technology and retracting any and all prior mischaracterizations of his professional standing. It was followed by a brief announcement of a $1 million donation from Ms. Thorne to the university's Theoretical Sciences Endowment. For the city's elite, it was a source of delicious, merciless gossip for a week. For Daniel, it was a closing chapter. He read it once, in his office, then filed it away. It brought him no joy, no sense of victory. It was merely the logical conclusion of a sequence of events he had set in motion. It was the balancing of an equation. Julian's company, Thorne Development, was crippled. He avoided bankruptcy, but at a great cost. He was forced to sell his most promising projects to competitors at a fraction of their value to cover the massive settlement with Sterling Cromwell. The flashy convertible was repossessed. The whispers about his stolen success followed him everywhere, making it impossible to secure new funding. He and Amelia stayed together, bound not by affection, but by a shared disgrace and a mountain of debt. The magnificent house on the water became their prison, a constant reminder of the height from which they had fallen. They lived in a monument to their own folly. Daniel's life, in contrast, expanded not in opulence, but in purpose. He declined Arthur Sterling's offer of a lavish corner office at the firm's headquarters in New York. Instead, he used a portion of his earnings to establish a small, independent research and development incubator in his home city. He leased a floor in a new, modern building downtown, a space filled with light, whiteboards, and the quiet hum of powerful computers. His new office was the antithesis of the house he'd left. It was a space dedicated to creation, not presentation. The walls were glass, promoting transparency and collaboration. The centerpiece was not a piece of art, but a massive, interactive data visualization screen, displaying the elegant, flowing architecture of his new projects. He didn't buy a fancy car or a designer watch. His greatest luxury was freedom. The freedom to pursue any idea that sparked his interest. The freedom to fund any promising young mind who came to him with a problem they couldn't solve. One afternoon, a simple cream-colored envelope arrived at his new office. There was no return address. He recognized the handwriting immediately. He opened it and read Amelia's short, handwritten note of apology. He read it twice. It was the first time in years she had communicated with him without an audience, without a motive beyond the words themselves. It was a small, genuine act in a life that had been filled with performance. He felt no anger, no lingering resentment. He simply folded the note and placed it in a desk drawer. It was an artifact from a past life, a life that no longer belonged to him. His focus was on the present. He was mentoring a young analyst named Maya, a brilliant but shy woman whose quiet demeanor reminded him a little of himself. She was working on a complex problem, and her colleagues had dismissed her approach as too theoretical, too impractical. Daniel saw the spark in her ideas. He sat with her for hours, not giving her answers, but asking her the right questions, helping her build the framework to find the answers herself. "They think it's a dead end," she said one day, looking discouraged. Daniel looked up from the lines of code on her screen. "The world is full of people who can only see dead ends," he said, his voice calm and encouraging. "They stand in front of a wall and see only a barrier. They don't see that a wall is also a foundation. Your job isn't to listen to them. Your job is to build something on that foundation that's so tall they can't help but see over the wall." He saw the understanding dawn in her eyes, the flicker of renewed confidence. In that moment, he felt a satisfaction more profound than any royalty payment or legal victory. He had turned the pain of his own experience into a lesson, a ladder he could now offer to someone else. His wealth was not in his bank account. It was in his ability to create, to build, to see the value that others missed. His power was not in his ability to destroy. It was in his ability to empower. The rusty toolbox sat not in a garage, but in a secured, climate-controlled server room at Sterling Cromwell, a silent, humming monument to the idea that the most valuable things are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the vision to see their true worth. He had lost a house, but he had gained a world, and he was just beginning to build it. The story of Daniel and Amelia became a quiet fable in their old social circles, a cautionary tale about arrogance and the danger of underestimating the quiet ones. But for Daniel, it was never a story about revenge. It was a story about truth. The truth he had learned is like the tide. You can build sandcastles of lies and self-deception, but eventually, inevitably, the tide comes in. It doesn't rage, it doesn't shout, it simply rises, calmly and unstoppably, and washes away everything that isn't built on solid ground. His greatest victory was not the moment of revelation in the garage. It was this quiet afternoon in his sunlit office, watching a young mind catch fire with a new idea. He had faced humiliation and emerged not with bitterness, but with wisdom. He had been given every reason to become cruel, but he had chosen to become a creator. The final, most important thing he built was not an algorithm, but a better version of himself. And that was a treasure no one could ever put a price on, and no one could ever take away.